I didn't really think that, I wasn't sure what to think, truthfully, when I first saw the figure. It wasn't until I started reading the actual appraisal itself. And the wording in it just, it sent up red flags. Yeah, so the second appraisal was in the beginning of May, which was
In the end
shortly,
of May.
or the end of May, which is not long after the first one. So that was my question to my bank is, how did I lose $15,000 in my home value in a month? And so then that's when I went to work, and I took all of that artwork down, and I removed all of the pictures, um, and I staged, my home to look as ethnically neutral as possible. So if you walked in, could you say that a black woman lives here? Could you say what the race of the woman is, period, that lives here? I mean, you could say it's a woman, because, So I met with two of my good girlfriends. One's black, one's white, both married to white men. And I said, I need to borrow one of your husbands. And so they were both like, "Oh, you can have mine," you know. And so I told them what I wanted to do. I said, "I want your husband to be my brother, and I want them to stand in for me at the appraisal. That's it." I emailed the appraisal company because I didn't even want them to hear my voice. So I emailed the company and I said, I will not be available, um, and my brother will be in my place, but he's over 18. And so they were like, no problem. They responded through email, no problem. Please send us his contact information. Uh, so my friend came over, and after the appraisal, he texted me and was just like, "All clear, it's done." Uh, so so that appraisal came back for 259. That I had to go through all of that just to say that I was right, and that this was happening, that this was real. And it just is so upsetting because you have the data that says this is what happens. You have it, but it's not until it happens to a person that somebody knows that they're like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe it." How can you not believe it? The data said it was real. The data said it was happening. But it's just being able, thank you, being able to prove it is the hard part. And so I just felt blessed that I had the ability, the financial ability to go through all of this, not even financially in terms of having the means, the money to do it, but having the credit to be able to do it, because whose credit can take four hits like that in a year and survive? And especially if you're black and you don't have a history of financial education in your family. So you everything that I know about credit, I've had to learn. And so when I went through this entire process and got to the end, and I was like, I felt like I told you, but I also felt like this needs to change. It needs to change. This process needs to change. And the first person that came to mind was Amy. Because I'm like, who better to know all of the processes that are involved in appraising a home or in their rules and regulation when it comes to home ownership than the Fair Housing Center. So I didn't know what to do with all of this that I had gone through. I just know I needed to do something with it. And so that's when I was like, Amy, this is what happened to me. This is the information. What can be done? Is there anything that can be done? And she said, we're gonna work together, we're gonna try.
The appraisal industry itself is part of why Carlette's neighborhood had to do sweat equity homes in order to have an opportunity at home ownership. The appraisal industry supported the redlining maps, and they were part of that particular process that completely kept Blacks, African Americans, as well as some others out of the opportunity to be able to purchase homes in the run when our modern day financing system began in the 1930s and 1940s, where we could use mortgages to purchase homes instead of cash. Blacks, African Americans were just completely shut out of that process, and the appraisal industry, played a role in that from the very beginning. And we also see it certainly in just who are appraisers. They're overwhelmingly white males. There's a significant lack of diversity in the appraisal industry as well. Carlette talked about the process of it being more art than science as part of it. I disagree. I think there is a lot of science there, but the appraisal industry has been able to give this perception of it being art and science that then results in them to be able to run almost unchecked or unable to be verified as to how whether or not they are following recommended guidelines or not as part of it. So this unfortunately has been a long time coming. This has been a problem for decade upon decade upon decade, and it's only because of people like Carlette, the family in the New York Times story, a number of other families have been making press news, speaking up and saying something is wrong, something is broken, and I'm going to try to do something to fix this. That we are now in a position that we are, where we are able to move forward on these complaints. Long road ahead, but every journey begins with a single step.
Welcome back, Miguel. Hello, Marcos, Tom, Patricia, Blanca. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to watch that. That's going to pretty much open us into our conversation today. If we could maybe go round robin and say your name and the organization that you're representing, and then we'll start our conversation from the video that we just watched. So just for the audience to know who you are when you're speaking, if we can start with that, Miguel.
Yeah, Miguel Perez. I'm with the Housing Authority of Tulare County.
All right, Blanca.
Blanca Escobedo. I'm the Tulare County Policy Advocate for Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability.
Patricia.
Hi, I'm Patty Fink. I'm with California Rural Legal Assistance, and I'm the legal director for the Fair Housing Unit.
Tom.
And I'm Tom Collishaw, the CEO of Self-Help Enterprises.
And I'm Marcos Segura, staff attorney with the National Housing Law Project.
Sweet deal. Good evening, everybody. I'm Lisa Alvarado, Women Wise, on behalf of TC Voices. Thank you all for joining us and tuning in. We hope to have a fruitful conversation about housing in Tulare County and how that relationship ties into racism. We hope to take a deeper dive and then also offer resources for folks. For our panelists, this conversation is for community. So if we can just kind of wear that community facing hat and remember that folks watching this could really utilize the resources that you offer. And so we'll take some time to jump into resources and some hopeful wins later on in the conversation. But in order to give folks some frame of reference, let's start with maybe where we are. And maybe Miguel, if you would mind maybe sharing from after watching the video, maybe some initial thoughts, and we'll just kind of jump into conversation from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's truly shameful that we're still in an age where there's racism that's taking place in housing, but that is a reality. There are resources to battle that, and I believe those are much more accessible. So I think that's a starting point to making sure that we address what I've referred to as blatant racism that would take place in such a process, which is an appraisal, someone applying to rent a home, and so on. And so I think that's part of the conversation. But I think it's also important that we go beyond that and we look at really assessing how do we break the systematic barriers that have already existed in our nation for so long, and that it has precluded individuals of color or women or other minorities from having access to quality housing or affordable housing. And so I think that's an important segue and an important piece of an important component that I think we need to really engage as a community to really be able to come up with some effective solutions.
Thank you so much, Blanca. What do you think, or what are you guys seeing at the Leadership Council?
We are seeing a lot of barriers right now to homeowner equity and also tenant equity, not only because of the debt that is associated with, or not debt, but the cost of associated with buying a house or renting. But we're seeing that there's not enough resources and representation in the housing industry and in governance to really address all the barriers that people of color and lower income populations have to face in order to get a home, to rent a home, to buy a home, to get approved for a mortgage, and all of that. So it's obvious that people of color are impacted disparately and disproportionately. And it's, to some people, it may not be obvious that it's a racial structure that put that in there in the first place. But we need, like Mio said, we need to dismantle those systemic infrastructures and systemic barriers that are there that were put there in the first place, and have those tough conversations with governance in order to bring those down.
Absolutely. And Patricia, I think with your current role, what are you guys seeing in relationship to also like Tulare County? I know that the video maybe was not specific to Tulare County, but as Blanca and Miguel shared, it's prevalent. What can you share?
I don't have specifics on Tulare County. Personally, I'm new to the Central Valley. I'm from the Santa Rosa area up north. And we have an office in Delano. We don't have an office in Tulare County. So we definitely are dealing with the issues in other areas across the state, though. And these policies that were mentioned in the video, the government policies that were in place years ago that created and perpetuated the segregation and discrimination, have really snowballed into all of the things we're seeing today. It's the residual of the segregation and discrimination. And so there really needs to be an overhaul of so many things. I mean, in the video, she mentioned how the the appraisal industry, how the appraisal industry is mostly white and mostly male. I think the percentages are like in 80-85%. And then there's barriers to allowing women and persons of color to get into that field. So that's something that really needs a complete overhaul, when we're talking about making significant change. And a CRLA has not had a lot of calls on the appraisal issue. We are aware of it. There was the case in Marin County with the appraisal coming back totally different after the family removed everything and replaced it with all white pictures and indications that it was a white family living there. So we know those things are going on. We haven't had that many calls now. I'm also aware that HUD and DFEH are looking more carefully at the appraisal issue. So definitely something we want to watch for and do whatever we can when we hear about it.
Thank you. Tom, would you mind chiming in a bit from Self Help Enterprises?
Yeah, well, I was struck by the notion that that horrible personal story was taking place now and not just in 1955. What we see at Self Help Enterprises, we're on the production side of affordable housing, and we continually have to fight for higher appraisals in the communities that we're in the neighborhoods we're in more urban environments. So this is a real thing, and people of color do have much a greater challenge in terms of accessing resources and finding good affordable housing in neighborhoods that are safe. And so we see it all the time. And I would just also chime in that that's one of the things she was able to do. The person in the video was to reach out to some resources. We do home buyer counseling, we do financial fitness and credit counseling, and for people who are interested in buying a home or renting at a better place, and we can teach about what these processes are and also what their rights are, and what kind of fair housing rules there are.
Thank you. Marcos, would you mind sharing?
Sure. So at the National Housing Law Project, we're aware of the issue. We're looking to see, because we're more of a national organization, even though I'm actually headquartered in Fresno, and I'm actually originally from Tulare County, Dinuba specifically. But just looking at the national landscape, seeing how these cases unfold, looking for opportunities to, not just litigate the issue, but maybe come up with some policy fixes, which is the majority of what we do. But what I was struck by this person's story, and I heard this story a long time, or a few months ago, I should say, on NPR. And what I think it highlights is that these policies, these practices that are racist and result in racial housing segregation don't really end. They just evolve. So you'll do something about these biased, racist appraisal issues, and it'll just manifest its way or itself in some other way. And that's because at the very heart of all these things is this racist notion that someone's race or religion inherently, causes a property to be worth less or a neighborhood to be less desirable. And that notion has been ingrained in our society to such a point that it's part of every single one of us to some extent. And it manifests itself in conscious and subconscious way. And we never actually dealt with that directly and had those tough conversations. So I think this is a good platform to not just talk about the law and litigation and policy fixes, but to address that directly, because ultimately what's really at the heart of the issue is something you can't litigate or legislate away. It's something you have to address directly. You have to acknowledge that racism and the vestiges of that racism and grapple with that.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I feel like after watching the video, and I know we jumped in on just kind of addressing the video and kind of doing some blanket statements, maybe for somebody who's not familiar with redlining, not familiar with how maybe communities were first made. Does anybody maybe feel comfortable sharing how the zoning or how city planning played a role into what we're seeing now? Maybe from a policy standpoint. I know, Patty, you talked a little bit about how what we're seeing is like the fruition of basically what had happened long ago. Can you maybe share in a couple sentences to somebody like what had happened?
Well, the redlining took place in places like Chicago, major cities, even San Diego, other places. I heard there were maps that were created, and they were actually drawn in red to tell realtors or lenders where they could promote houses and mortgages, and that was at the time when mortgages were first used to purchase homes. Prior to that, you had to purchase your home with cash. So when they started the mortgage system, they actually created maps and drew red lines around areas where they said these, there are areas that were for white people only, persons of color, African Americans were not allowed in those areas, and that resulted in really segregated cities. And Chicago is very segregated today. I was going to say, I heard recently that there were no maps of Bakersfield. Found no redlining maps, so that was interesting. But in the areas across the country where they did the redlining, you can see that the segregation still exists, and it put the people of color in a position of holding them back and preventing them from getting the homes, getting in all the better services. And there started the wealth gap that has just, continued and gotten out of control today.
Thank you, Tom. I know that you had shared something about the San Joaquin Valley and how it grew. Is this a good time to maybe chime in, or you want to share that a little bit later?
Yeah, I think I'd like to share that. I mean, it is unmistakable that the way many communities and many areas grew in the San Joaquin Valley, including in Tulare County, is that there's a number of unincorporated communities. And it's unmistakable that many of them grew because they were populated by people who were not welcome in the cities. And so they may have started as migrants during the Dust Bowl, and they may have been white complected, and then later were replaced by people of color. But communities like Teviston, communities like Early Mart, these are unincorporated communities that people clearly were not welcomed in those communities. So it's a different form of redlining than maybe what was seen in Chicago, but it was certainly redlining in any way you describe it.
I want to open this up to the panelists because you all are really the expertise and the brilliance in this field. And so we'll kind of have open dialogue, but I feel like Patty and Tom kind of gave us some context, or maybe Marcos and Blanca to maybe talk about your respective fields, because I feel like what you are in kind of lends to this. And then maybe Miguel, we can talk about what's to come for you in policy after that, if that might work for folks. But feel encouraged to take over. Sure. This is our panel, so please, by all means.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the history, I'm by no means a scholar of racial segregation in its history, but like Patty said, redlining was a huge sort of event in our housing segregation history. But it started a long time before that. You had cities that actually had zoning laws that expressly said, if you're Black or you're Jewish, you can't live in this particular neighborhood. It was a state-sanctioned zoning laws that segregated people initially, and then those things were those kinds of policies were ruled unconstitutional about 1917 or so, and then the private sector kind of took over through restricted covenants, which are just deed restrictions that say that if you happen to be of a particular religion or particular race, you can't buy or rent a particular property. And it wasn't just, these covenants didn't just thrive because of individual homeowners. The real estate industry actually, used these covenants, encouraged them, enforced them. That was ruled unconstitutional about 1950 or so. But people continue to use them. Some courts actually continue to enforce them. And then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act made them completely illegal. And that's right around the time that you had this redlining, which, as Patty mentioned, was a way to divide an area based on risk by mortgage lenders, insurers, and coincidentally, the areas that were considered the riskiest in terms of mortgage loans, in terms of insurance products, were Black and Brown communities. And so then you have redlining, and now you have reverse redlining, which is where actually is these poor communities of color are targeted for subprime mortgage loans of every different type. After the 2008 market crash, it came out that a lot of these communities of poor communities of color were targeted and actually directed toward subprime mortgages when they in fact qualified for traditional manageable loans. And then this appraisal issue is just part of that. And like I was saying, it's just it's the same practice with the same end. It just takes a different form, generation to generation. And like I said, the reason for that is we don't really get to the heart of what's really underlying that, which is more of an individual community type of conversation about race and how it kind of seeps into every single one of us.
Blanca, I would love it if we could maybe, we're hearing a lot about we're hearing a lot about home buyers and the process of appraisal and lending. Can we maybe transition to some of our folks who are maybe renting? What are some of our renters facing?
Right now, especially because of the COVID pandemic, the economic crisis that has hit us in the last year, we're seeing a lot of tenants who are in very vulnerable positions. We have a large undocumented population here, and we also have a large minority, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx population that is not sometimes faces tenant issues such as they don't have formal contracts with their landlords. And so sometimes they can't defend themselves or don't have the necessary documentation to defend themselves in court if they're ever to be evicted. We have a lot of tenants right now who are living in substandard housing, who their landlord or their apartment, wherever they live, they don't have access to, or they have infrastructure that's dilapidated. And so, for example, we hear renters who their oven doesn't work and their landlord refuses to fix it. And so there's a lot of fear of retaliation there. And so they have to fix it themselves. And that impacts, their quality of life because sometimes they don't have adequate cooling, they don't have adequate weatherization to protect them from the heat. And so they're overburdened with the rent, they have fear of retaliation, and there really is an underrepresentation right now of attorneys in the Central Valley and legal aid and tenant protections. And so without that, these tenants are in really vulnerable position right now, especially because of the evictions moratorium ending soon unless it gets extended. So if there's not enough resources for them to follow through with, to get access to, then we're going to see a really big impact on these populations, and hopefully not, but maybe like a surge in homelessness, a surge in people living in multifamily homes where it could create safety issues and overall impact their quality of life.
Yeah, I feel like you just shared like 17 topics that I would like to just like break down right now. I want to talk about the eviction moratorium for sure. And I also want to talk about some of the landlord mitigation funds, some of these things that we have offering, because I'm seeing in some of our previous chats with the Visalia Times-Delta that some of our community really likes to talk about, we wish our tenants wouldn't just trash, so these landlords, wouldn't be forced to evict. And so there's a lot of that rhetoric that we have to get through. But I want to offer space for Miguel to kind of share his narrative, and then maybe we'll move into that, and then we'll start transitioning into some of our hopeful wins. And Tom, I'd love to hear about the self-help project that you guys are working on for affordable housing also.
Yeah, so on our end, we have a variety of different programs that we're currently administering for some specific city. So we have a rental assistance program for the city of Tulare and one for the city of Dinuba. I believe there are some other cities within the county that are also providing some of that funding through United Way, and I believe Self-Help may be involved in some of those uh, processes as well. But however, there is a statewide program which is providing the opportunity for both tenants and landlords to apply and to be able to be reimbursed for some of the outstanding rent amounts or unpaid rents that may have accrued as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I would advocate anybody who is in dire need of assistance and is concerned about facing a possible eviction due to an outstanding rent to reach out to HCD, that's the Housing Community Development Department of the State of California, and the Housing is Key program. Again, that program is being directly administered by the state, and I believe there's still some funding left. So I would advocate that they would reach out to that to that particular resource, and they are looking at assisting specifically individual households that are low income or very low income. On our end, we have 117 emergency housing choice vouchers that were allocated and awarded to our agency as of last week. They will be available on July 1st of this upcoming month. And those vouchers will be specifically targeted to certain populations for households or individuals that are homeless, at risk of being homeless, or for families or individuals that are fleeing domestic violence or human trafficking.
And I do want to share for some of the folks maybe watching online, any of the resources that you hear, we'll do our very best to come back. I know Miguel just mentioned the housing is key. And so for folks really looking for those resources, I will do my best after this stream, if they're not already up to do that. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Miguel. Maybe why don't we go around in each of our prospective industries and maybe share what do we have to look forward to as far as resources today? How can folks get resources from where you represent, and how does that relate to housing? I love that everybody does that looking face, because that means you're actually thinking. So thank you. Patty, would you like to go first?
So, sure, I'll jump in and just say that, well, we know that the CDC order with the COVID protections is set to expire June 30th. We're hoping that and hopeful that there will be an extension of some sort, if not federally, at least here in California, to give a longer protection to the tenants who are hurting, who lost income because of COVID and can't pay their rent. Also, the homeowners who haven't been able to make their mortgage payments due to COVID. There were some protections for homeowners as well. We had the forbearance program where homeowners could get a forbearance on their mortgage and get a delay in having to make their payments. And hopefully what we have to do is watch what the lenders, how they're going to approach that. There were so many different ways that they were taking action on the forbearances. And so we have to monitor those things to make sure that they're putting the money at the end of the loan and giving the homeowner a chance to catch up. But again, we've got the financial assistance coming, hopefully. The Housing Assistance Fund, that's the federal fund that is being distributed to states. And it's my understanding that June 30th is the deadline for the states to provide their plan, submit their plan to the federal government in order to get funding so that they can then distribute it to homeowners. So the homeowners have that going for them. And then the tenants also, I think, as Miguel said, have the ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that tenants and landlords can get. So those are the things that we're hopeful about right now. And certainly, some of these things have been so difficult for people to access, especially the most vulnerable, the people that we serve. And, whether they don't have internet access and the applications are all online, a variety of things, whether there's a language barrier. So, in those cases, we hope that, we have community workers across our state that are doing outreach, and we hope that we're getting the message out so that people who need help and need help accessing it will contact one of our offices or one of the other agencies like we're talking about here to get the help they need. They need assistance getting that help because so often it's really complicated and difficult.
Absolutely. And I know I love what you said about just two prime examples are a language barrier and just access to technology. We covered this in the previous TC Voices about how that plays in from a systemic racism point to now. Blanca, would you maybe like to share about some of your resources?
Sure. So right now, Leadership Council for Justice Accountability, when we talk to residents from the communities we work with and elsewhere in Tulare County, we are not exactly a legal aid organization, but we always refer them to CRLA or CCLS. But whenever we can give them advice and refer them to those resources and help them apply for the MRAP funding, and also we know that Tulare County is partnering with self-help enterprises, and I think Tom can talk further about this, about their mortgage and utility assistance program that I'm not sure if has started yet, but we partner them with resources like that. But we also see a really good opportunity coming up for the Tulare County Board of Supervisors specifically to take action and help kind of evade this, hopefully not like eviction wave coming soon, by maybe allocating some of their American Rescue Plan dollars that is coming their way soon to tenant rental protection. So for example, like a right to counsel, so that renters going through an eviction have the right to receive counsel from an attorney. Because oftentimes, the majority of the times actually, tenants don't have access to an attorney while landlords do. And that's a huge gap that we see that plays an unfair advantage to landlords.
Absolutely. And Blanca, I just want to share too, maybe if there's any other things that you might want to bring up, because I know that we'll probably go around one more time and then we'll maybe focus more on some of the Q&A from the audience. So if you have anything, just let me know and then we'll come circle back around. Tom, would that be a good time maybe for you to try to jump in? I know Blanca mentioned some of the mortgage protection that you, yep.
Sure. Yeah, and the first thing I would say is there are a lot of resources that have been designated for either mortgage assistance, utility assistance, or rental assistance, but it's very confusing. The state has made it about as confusing as possible by giving localities sort of their choice whether they want to operate it or whether they want to defer to the state. Blanca is correct. We've had resources and we've been sending them out the door for mortgage and at one-time rental assistance and utility assistance. And then the state, when they got the ERAP money that was referred to earlier, said you can't do the rental assistance through that anymore. The Housing Authority is doing some of it. So it's very confusing. And I would just say to people, the money's there, the resources are there. Just please ask, it's hard work, unfortunately, but please ask the questions and reach out to people like Self-Help Enterprises and the Housing Authority to make sure that you're exhausting any of the opportunities that may be there, and the state of California. But it is very confusing, unfortunately, but the resources are there.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to the process. I think a lot of folks don't take into consideration that we're regular humans navigating this process on top of still trying to like navigate current employment, navigate mental well-being, navigate being families and parents. And so some people forget that the process it can be labor intensive and it can be confusing, but there are resources. Marcos, would you maybe mind sharing on some resources that you have available to folks?
Yeah, I mean, my organization is, so we act mostly as support for advocates on the ground, and we have a national sort of lens. So we don't have anything specific that I think would be helpful to folks in terms of nuts and bolts about assistance. But as everyone has mentioned, there's rental assistance out there. It's out there. It's hard to get to because of everything everybody has mentioned. But do your absolute best to, if you have family members that don't speak English or don't speak English very well, like take an interest in them and ask them if they've applied for assistance and help them navigate that process, and just do everything that you can to access those dollars because they're there. And one of the big things that's narratives right now is that this money isn't being spent and therefore it's not necessary, but it's absolutely the opposite is true. And the only other thing that I would mention is that even if you do manage to do everything right, maybe even access those dollars, there's no guarantee that your landlord will not try to evict you. So always, have handy your local legal aid organization's information and number. For Tulare County, it's Central California Legal Services, where I used to work right before NHLP. It's a great shop. So they provide free legal services if you qualify, to folks in Tulare County, Fresno County, Kings County. So if you have any issues at all, even after doing everything that you can possibly do, there's still something that can be done to save your tenancy.
Yeah, I am hesitant to go straight into some of the policy hopefuls, because I'm trying to wrap my head around the average viewer. And we just talked a lot, and I know that this is heavy stuff because this is where we live. Can we just maybe have a transparent conversation since we talked about racism and we talked about how poverty is in relationship to racism? What can you say about the people that you guys are working alongside? What is it that the people that you're serving, how can we help switch some of the narrative that, that people are dirty, people are, we're hearing a lot of that negative rhetoric. How can we share with community better language? And the reason why I say this, living in Tulare County myself, as a woman navigating this current situation, I've noticed that I've had to have really difficult conversations on what does poverty look like from an independent business owner? What does not cutting it this time around? It's like, I look like this, I can speak like this, but not a lot of people have these tools that I do that can express. And so how do we share with the greater community to kind of really take that hat off and understand that this is something that's systemic, and poverty isn't really something to be shameful of, especially in that systemic lens?
Lisa, I would like to kind of speak on that.
Please.
We specifically work with families and individuals that are low income. And I think the misconception is that, individuals that are receiving Section 8 assistance or reside in public housing or affordable housing projects, programs, don't work or are lazy. And that is complete opposite. Most of the families and individuals that we do assist are working, and they are the working poor. And it speaks of the lack of access to quality jobs and high opportunity areas that I think we struggle as a region here in Tulare County. And so I think it's very important that we address that rhetoric and we take the necessary steps to educate our community and let them know that this isn't a problem just of poor people or unmotivated individuals or families. I mean, these are individuals who are very hardworking and they are doing everything they can to stay afloat. And so I think it's important to recognize that.
Yeah, I might jump in too. We are privileged to work with folks that the only difference between them and people who are of more means is that they have lacked an opportunity, and given the opportunity, they will do whatever they can to improve the lives of their family and their children. And we see that, definitely in our self-help housing program, where people to own a house commit to 40 hours a week of labor for 10 to 12 months, working alongside 9 other neighbors to build their first home and create their down payment through that sweat equity. Their desire to improve their lives, improve the lives for their children, I would stack it up against any member of society. And unfortunately, over the years, I've been in many situations proposing projects and those kinds of things where some really hideous things are said about this perception people have that's just because somebody is of a lower income or lower rung on the economic ladder, that they somehow don't deserve the kinds of opportunities that they've had in their lives. And it's hideous, frankly, and it's ugly to see. But all we can do is continue to model and have those folks show what they're made of, and they do that through our programs and in our rental projects. They're great projects where great people live and are getting opportunities that they've never had before. So all we can do is keep proving that it's that there's some people that are just wrongheaded about this.
I'd like to share, if that's okay. So one of the unique things I think about our work is that we co-power with community, and we work alongside the community. And a lot of the residents and group leaders who we work with in the unincorporated communities in Athena Tract, Pixley, Tullyville, Ivanhoe, is that a lot of these residents still buy into those stereotypes. They know that they have the right to ask for fair housing, infrastructure, and services, just like any other population in the county, whether they live in an incorporated city or whether their income is higher or whether they don't work in ag and food service, or any sort of manual labor job that is looked down upon. And so we are really lucky to work with them and learn from them every year and every day. And one of the things that we learn in our community conversations with them is that their experiences, seeking services from government or seeking services from employers, is that they reject that and they say we have, and by us partnering with them and sharing resources with them and also advocating them at the government level, state level, local level, it's really a learning process for everybody. And we often see a lot of barriers come down from government officials when we build relationships with them between communities and those government electeds. And they really get to know those community residents. So we hope to see more of that and more of those stereotypes start to dismantle, because it's simply not true. And a lot of the people living in these communities that are experiencing such severe gaps in services and infrastructure know that. And they have a right to be able to tell their government that, to be able to tell their employers that, and so on.
Of course, Pat, I think you're on mute though, Patty.
Sorry about that. I guess that always has to get said at least once during. So I wanted to take something further as to what Tom said about the things you hear said about the people, and Miguel mentioned it with the ideas and the misperception of people not working hard or not trying or being less than. And I think we, in our positions of social justice fighters, have to change that narrative. So we have to do what we can to change that, building some type of strength in those communities and providing more access for our clients, the persons that we serve, to get into the places they need to get into, to learn, to be educated, to have access to the government agencies that they need to, in order to give input for their communities, to contribute and to help create these communities that we want, that are integrated and educated and strong and caring for each other. And so we in everything we do, we need to be mindful about changing that narrative and helping the people we serve get access to the things they need to, so they can have a voice and they can be part of making changes to improve the communities that we know need so much help.
I love that so much. And what I love so much is, Blanca, your word about co-power. And it was cool because, Patty, when you shared that, my brain was envisioning, the education piece. So that way folks in this situation know to be empowered to ask for fair housing. We talked about the knowing of the policy and how that works, and understanding that it's systemic, and kind of standing in that ownership too, and just knowing. I want to look at the time, and I want to make sure that we cover some of the things to be hopeful about, and some of the wins that we can maybe celebrate and maybe learn from and look towards. And I know we also want to talk a little bit about policy too. So maybe you can start marinating in your brain some of the wins that you're seeing, and then we'll save the last 5-ish minutes for just open time. But would anybody maybe like to start off? Nobody jump at one.
I'll get started.
Okay, thanks, Miguel.
So as a governmental agency, we're in charge, and we're not only just compliant with fair housing law, but we're also working to enforce uh, and move along fair housing values. And so we're responsible for affirmatively furthering fair housing. And what that means is really kind of looking at the unintended consequences of systematic racism and how that has affected barriers that minorities or low income individuals face when it comes to housing. The Department of Housing and Urban Development had developed a specific rule, a friendly fair housing rule in 2015 during the Obama era, in which it was going to require for any governmental agency to receive federal funding to go through an assessment of utilizing data to be able to recognize what these barriers were and to take action and come up with solutions on how to resolve that. Now, in 2018, the Trump administration and our at that point Secretary Dr. Carson came in and suspended the implementation of that specific rule. As you referenced, he referenced that it was a means to implement social engineering. The rule was altogether thrown out back in 2020, but with the Biden administration taking over this year, it was announced in April of this year that the rule will be re-implemented, and so all governmental agencies are kind of just waiting to see what that will look like. Full disclosure, the rule itself, initially, the tool that we were supposed to utilize to kind of conduct this assessment was a little bit deficient. But again, we're hoping that will be resolved. The nice thing is that when we started engaged in this process, we started working with other governmental agencies here in Tulare County and some of the neighboring counties, specifically Kings County. And it was really looking at not just analyzing the data, but really conducting the public outreach and ensuring that the public was involved in that process. So it was also going to provide an opportunity for us to learn as a community of what some of these underlying issues had been historically, and what some of these the consequences of some of these unintended policies that are still prevalent and are kind of have directed for so long the way that the housing boundaries or where people end up living have come about. So I think it's hopeful, and we're looking forward to engaging in that process and see what we can learn, and really utilizing those lessons to try to make some real change.
Yeah,
of course, go ahead. Perfect.
I was just going to say, in terms of victories, people mentioned, that one of the ways that you combat some of this bias, some of this racism is turning those stereotypes on their head and highlighting folks that don't fit that stereotype, or creating the narrative that that's just a stereotype. It's not the rule for most people. But I think another part of that equation is recognizing, or getting people to recognize, sort of the impact of these racist practices and policies throughout the history. Because a lot of people say, why do you bring up restrictive covenants or Jim Crow? That's from long ago. What does it have to do with anything here? Until people recognize and are willing to acknowledge and accept the fact that those policies have an impact generations down the line, you're not going to be able to deal with that bias. And so in terms of hope and victory, I'm glad to see that the Biden administration, at least with some of the policies they're proposing, are creating policies with that lens to sort of bridge the racial gap that's been created by the vestiges of these racist policies. So that's a little bit of a flash of hope. Also the conversations that kind of started last summer, although in my personal view, they're sort of waning a little bit. But it got people thinking differently. Yeah, people thinking about those things and recognizing those things and being open to those things, because, almost without fail, when you bring up all of that stuff, it's like, people say, I've had a hard scrabble life. I made it. Why should I have to suffer or give anything up for people that are in the same situation, and they don't understand sort of the impact of the cumulative impact of these racist policies. But at least the administration is somewhat acknowledging that in some respect.
I would just add that one of the things that I'm hopeful about, and I've seen as real change in recent years, is that there has been a number of state laws and legislation that's passed that has made it significantly more apparent to cities and counties that they have a responsibility to do what they can to support affordable housing development and affordable housing efforts, and efforts to deal with homeless populations. And that starts with the housing element, which requires that every city has to have a plan for how they're going to take their fair share of housing and encourage development. But most importantly, there have been significant changes that if you have zoning, if you have a zoned site, you pretty much, if you're doing an affordable housing project, you could do it what's known as by right as a developer. And most of the cities and counties, they get this now. So they are different conversations than they were 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And that's a positive thing for us. We love engaging with the neighbors, and we'll talk to them and we'll try to mitigate any concerns that they have. But the decision makers don't get to just listen to people because they expect a bad vote if they vote the wrong way on a project. They really don't have much discretion anymore. So that's a positive change.
Thank you for saying that, Tom. And it reminded me too, like to what Marcos was saying, what can people do for community that hear you and think that that's so far from their ethos? Like, how can regular community engage with that process other than just being vocal? Are there like sign-on letters that they should be sharing with council? Are there maybe social media pages that they should be following? What can regular humans do when they're hearing these types of things and they're like, okay, what tool, where do I go for this? Where's my call to action? Where do I channel my energy?
I'm waiting for Blanca to answer that.
I was having trouble unmuting. Okay, I'm good now. I was going to. That's actually really great because we see a lot of opportunities coming up where communities can get engaged in actual policy. And policy, while it may seem slow, while it may seem like it has no quick change, it actually does, because it's actually enforceable when it's in a general plan, when it's in a city planning document. And so we see a lot of opportunities coming up. Tulare County is updating the housing element next year. So there's a really good opportunity to include inclusionary zoning policies that will make it easier for affordable housing to be developed. Right now, also, Tulare County is updating their environmental justice. Actually, they're creating their environmental justice element, and they have a really good social media webpage right now. I think it's Tulare County _EJ on like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And there's actually a committee where anybody can join, residents from disadvantaged communities can join and give their input and feedback that will translate to actual enforceable policies and narratives so that environmental justice in their communities can be addressed. We also see the RENA allocation process being developed right now, the regional housing, excuse me. So it's really important to be involved in that and get involved in committees and actually engage with your supervisors and the planning department, because there are tools for people to give all their feedback and experiences so they actually have real life narratives being included in that.
Thank you so much, Blanca. Does anybody maybe want to add before we transition to maybe some group Q&A?
I'll just add that I did see that, with the Tulare County housing element, that's expires, I think you said 2023. So it looks like the county at least put together information on their website where people can access and leave comments and read about what is being put into the housing element. So I thought that was really good that they've got it out there transparent for people to access. It's just a matter of educating people to know that they should take part in the housing element planning and promote things like the AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing, and making sure that it's followed, that they're doing something more than just saying they're going to increase affordable housing. They have to do something. And so the housing element is definitely one way that we can monitor and make sure that communities do what they're supposed to do, meeting the needs of their communities.
Thank you so much. Can somebody maybe share what is fair housing? If I have never heard that word before, and this is my first time watching this webinar, what could be described as fair housing to somebody?
I would say a simple way to describe it is the opportunity for people to choose where they want to live, regardless of the color of their skin, their gender, who they love, what their religion is, having the opportunity to choose where they want to live.
Thank you, Patty. And that also made me realize Happy Pride Month to everybody watching. If we're talking about true equity in a Tulare County framework, and we've acknowledged that we are having an issue with our neighbors experiencing homelessness, where do we need to grow in regards to fair housing? What do we need, like, critically? Because I know in previous conversations there was like 14 days left of housing available for folks, or something like that had been floating around, and then it created this panic amongst home buyers. And then from a tenant standpoint, there's not an affordable housing for renters. I know myself as a single person with a dog, looking around, I'm looking at minimum 900 in Exeter, if you will, and probably close to 2,000 in Visalia. What would fair housing look like for us, or what should it look like for us? Am I asking the hard questions?
Well, it has to be more supply. There's a problem. We don't have enough housing units, and when that happens, people get squeezed out on the various ends of the spectrum. And the homeless issue, I personally believe that until we embrace in Visalia and Tulare County more generally a housing first approach, and truly embrace that, we're not going to be able to solve it. And housing first basically is that people who are homeless need a place to live first and foremost. You need to give them a place to live, and then you get them the services that they need. If they are dealing with mental health challenges, or they're victims of domestic violence, or their whatever their challenges are, substance abuse, get them the help that they need, but get them into a home, because it's a much more efficient way. Just if you're a dollars and cents person, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to house somebody and get them services than it is to have them showing up at the emergency room and in the police station, every week. That's expensive to society. Housing people is not nearly as expensive, and that's why we really firmly believe that it's got to be that housing first approach. And until everybody embraces that, we're going to continue to struggle.
We also need to decriminalize homelessness, and not see it as someone doing anything wrong just because they don't have a place to live, because the system has priced them out, because it's their life situation prohibits them from maintaining or having access to housing. And we've seen a lot of raids in the city of Visalia from the Visalia Police Department on homeless encampments, and that's not right. So we really need to approach this from a really altruistic and empathetic manner.
Lisa, from a policy aspect of that as well, I mean, Tom is completely 100% right. There is a lack of housing, not just affordable housing, but there's just not enough housing, period, which usually creates a higher problem for those that have less resources and more barriers to have access to housing. And so with that said, I think there's been a shift in the way that the funding that we have received over the past 20 years, where there's been an emphasis on the rental assistance component. And so what we're finding out is that there's more rental assistance than we can be utilized, because we just don't have enough landlords that will want to rent to these individuals or households, or we don't have enough just units that are available. I mean, right now the rental market is extremely tight here in Tulare County. It's gotten tighter over the past 5 years. I'm really interested to see what the data will look like after the census, and we need to really kind of take a look at what that data looks like moving forward, because I think there's been a huge transition within Tulare County within the past 10 years.
Yeah, what it's interesting as we're having this dialogue, my brain is kind of like thinking of, we just talked about systemic piece. We talked about this is going to continue to get worse because we've identified that the system has created this and we're going to continue to replenish what it's been offering us. So I definitely see the critical piece of the policy. I definitely see the critical piece of the education. So we have the people kind of uprising to like ask for what we're deserved or earned, if you will. And I'm seeing some of the policy fixing or maybe lubricating, if you will, to create some things. Yeah, okay. I'm getting lost in my own story over here. Let me take a second to revisit some of the questions that were sent by some of our members in the committee. I know that I do want to talk about fair housing that's available right now, and I know that self-help is doing a really great job out in Goshen. I would love to talk about maybe that project, maybe to start us off. Would that be okay with you, Tom?
Sure. I love talking about housing in Goshen. Yeah, we're about to open, well, in the next several months, we will be opening the second phase of a large affordable rental housing complex in Goshen called Sequoia Commons. The first phase is already occupied at full build out. It's over 130 units of permanently affordable rental housing, including units that are set aside for permanent supportive housing, which are people that are coming out of homelessness and giving them a permanent place to live with a voucher. So that's important. We're also working with a local group called Salt and Light, who is going to build their first project on a site that we currently own and that we will be making available to them, where they want to do a manufactured small unit development, which again would be permanent supportive housing for people coming out of homelessness, and create a whole campus where people can improve their lives, have a permanent place to live, and it will be done much less expensively because it will be basically tiny homes in a enclosed community, in a safe community. So and then we also have planned self-help housing, single-family home ownership opportunity coming down the pike about at least a year from now. We're going to build close to 90 units of self-help homes as well. So we're really dealing with the whole spectrum of housing needs in that project.
Yeah, would you mind maybe sharing a little bit more? In the beginning of the conversation, you shared about the first-time home buyer. You shared a little bit about the credit support. Can you maybe elaborate for folks barely listening in if this is the first time they heard of these programs?
Sure. We are what's known as a home ownership center. So if people are interested in becoming a homeowner or learning more about home financing and how they would go about purchasing their first home, they can come to us. We can help assess where they are at from a credit standpoint and a buying power standpoint. They can go to home buyer education classes, either in person or online. And they can basically learn whether homeownership is going to be right for them. But I would say that in general, it's a good process to go through in any case, because you learn how to do a home budget. You learn how to do the stuff you didn't learn in high school, but probably should have. There ought to be courses in high school, but there aren't. So that's sort of step one. And then our self-help housing program is an opportunity for low-income families to achieve the American dream of home ownership by building a home with their own sweat, so to speak, along with some neighbors. And we're doing a project in Woodlake right now in that program. And I will just say, because we're talking about racial equity here, that we've been doing that program since 1965, helped over 6,500 families build their first home. And over 90% of those have been people of color. So we have been helping people build wealth through home ownership for 55 plus years. And that's a nice antidote to some of the other stories about segregation and discrimination and redlining and all those other things. We've been quietly going about this work for many years.
Thank you so much. It's interesting because navigating this process myself, it's like I have to understand that my parents were first-time home buyers later in their years, and so me navigating financial freedom or just financial stability is a whole conversation. And it's like I had to get stable before I could even learn about these things, which is just how mental wellness works. You kind of have to have stability and learn how to self-regulate in order for you to start building some of these pertinent life skills or these financial skill sets that you talk about. We are entering into our last leg of the race. We probably have about 5 more minutes before Jim comes on with some of the questions that have been filtering through Facebook. And those questions are going to cover all of the topics. So I wanted to maybe give everybody maybe 2 minutes to maybe share maybe final thoughts or maybe a call to action or anything maybe that came up through the conversation that you'd like to maybe circle or highlight. And if there's nothing, that's okay. We can take community questions.
I have a couple comments. I think these next couple of years are very important, and I would advocate for our community, for the public, to be engaged in these processes, specifically when we're looking at when we get started with the affirmative fair housing assessment. And so again, I think there's a lot of times what has happened historically is that those that go out there and scream the loudest tend to be heard, and historically that has not been disfranchised. And so I think it's important that as community leaders, we advocate to have an inclusive and a transparent process moving forward. So I think it's a very critical time, especially with the census and what that, and analyzing what that data will be very important moving forward.
Thank you. You brought me up to even think about like if folks are now currently living in a system that they can't afford because of the cost of living here, and we're all living in we're all multifamilies living in one space. The census is going to share that bleak reality that we're on weighted, we're on broken limber, whatever the word I'm trying to find. Yeah. Open floor. Any other dialogue before we turn over to the folks watching at home?
I'll jump in and just say that I think, even before the pandemic, there was a large percentage, that maybe 80% of renters spending more than 50% of their income on rent, across the state. And so we had problems before the pandemic, and now the pandemic has really shined a light on what's been happening to so many people of color, to so many low-income people, to persons with disabilities. So we really need to take this moment, and as Miguel said, we need to be engaged. We need to make important things happen. We can't let it go back to normal if that normal wasn't enough. So we have to do what we can in our positions to continue the fight of bringing access and opportunity to our clients and our communities that are most vulnerable, and what we can to create inclusive and integrated and educated communities. And by educated, I mean making people aware of their own opportunities, their own rights, and empowering them to speak up and to change what needs to be changed.
And if I'm understanding correctly, shouldn't housing be 30% of your overall housing budget? Isn't that like what California shares? So if you look at your total income and if you're spending more than that, or you're overutilizing your credit cards, that wouldn't be considered
ideal.
Housing, correct? Yeah, I think I'm at 60%. Ouch. Yeah. So yeah, that was one of my critical realizations when I started looking into my own personal life. And I'm like, oh, my own personal system is flawed. I need to relook at this. And then trying to find something that fit in that 30% budget wasn't possible. And so I took the next best bet, which is why I live here in Exeter. So yeah, those of you at home are looking at your own personal outpouring. You're not alone there. There was a question that came through my text message regarding self-help enterprises and ITIN. Tom, this is, I know, really specific. Is that something I should send them maybe to an email address or?
Yeah, that would be helpful. There are some restrictions for some of our programs because they're government programs about people's status as, legal status living in the United States, and some people can be borrowers and some can't from some of the programs. But I would encourage people to call us and get the specifics on that.
Good.
Okay, thank you. I definitely will share that. That looks like it for me. We got to our 8:15, and Jim is prompt. Thank you guys so much for engaging in that dialogue. I appreciate you all and allowing for that popcorn discussion. I really value that.
Thank you, Lisa.
Well, thank you, everyone. We've gotten some really interesting questions from our Facebook and YouTube audience, and I just wanted to jump in right away. We have a reader asking, and this kind of goes back to our last topic, Tom commented on this, but she's asking about barriers from people's immigration status to fair housing, how people people whose immigration status is up in the air or they're not documented, how they might have problems dealing with landlords or fears of complaining about substandard housing because they're undocumented. Can anyone address those issues, and what kind of help can we give to people who are undocumented when they face unfair housing problems?
I can talk about that a little bit, both in my experience defending evictions at CCLS, and also just from personal experience growing up in rural Tulare County. Tons of landlords, it's part of their business model to rent to undocumented individuals because they're unlikely to complain. If they do, it's really easy to get them back off from a repair request by simply threatening to go to immigration or something to that effect. In terms of what can be done to help these individuals, unfortunately, the organizations, the legal aid organizations that would defend people in that situation with withholding rent and requesting repairs, they have restrictions, federal restrictions. For the most part, they're federally funding, and part of their restrictions is they can't assist undocumented individuals. There might be some exceptions if there's a documented or a citizen household member. Maybe they can be assisted to that in that way. But Patty, maybe at Sierra LA, you guys have kind of dealt with this question before. I know we tried to kind of wrestle with it when I was at CCLS about how to provide assistance to folks where it's a mixed household. But yeah, no, it's very common, and it's very much a business model for a lot of landlords to have this structure and rent to individuals in this situation.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. And you're absolutely right that we do have restrictions at CRLA because we are federally funded. And as you said, if there are mixed citizenship status within a family, then yes, we can serve those families. But what I would also say is that people have some protections under state law. Landlords should not be asking about citizenship status. They should not be making those threats. And so people can complain to the state. They can complain to Department of Fair Employment and Housing, file a fair housing complaint. They do have the right to do that. And to add on to that, if there's discriminatory ads, we've recently been made aware that the state has a simplified form to submit to if you see an ad that says no children, no Section 8, no wheelchairs, as crazy as it sounds, there are maybe a landlord that would say no undocumented. If you see ads like that, you should file a complaint with the state, with DFEH, and they have a simplified form now that makes it very easy. I mean, they even are taking anonymous complaints. Of course, we don't recommend that. It's better to do the complaint where it can be processed, and those complaints CRLA does help with. So we help facilitate those types of complaints. But as Marco said, yes, we do have restrictions when it comes to serving persons that are undocumented.
And just, if I might just jump in, James, as an organization that owns and operates about 2,000 units of affordable rental housing, there's only about 20% of those units, about 300 of them, that we have to ask for documentation. The balance, 80% of those units, we don't ask anybody anything about their status. So it's only very specific programs where we have to ask.
Does anyone else want to chime in on this topic, or can I move on to another actually really interesting question from a reader? All right, I will let's go on and move on to the second question. This reader wants to know about how zoning and schools play into home value and good places to live. And she points out that good schools and grocery stores and other good places to shop are zoned into nicer neighborhoods, and some of the older or areas don't have those good schools, good places to shop, and that those zoning issues that both on a county and a city level kind of force people with lower incomes into areas without a lot of services, and then their home values go down, or the value of their property goes down. Does anyone want to talk about how cities and zoning plays into fair housing and good housing?
I would like to touch on this.
Sure. Go ahead, Blanca.
Who? Me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so cities and counties, even in the San Joaquin Valley, we see zoning that's exclusionary, even if it's not overt, by limiting the amount and what type of housing can be built or developed. So, like single family homes tend to be relatively more expensive. And so you kind of have a concentration of wealth, a concentration of higher income populations that attracts, for example, better businesses that provide healthier foods, or the property taxes pay for better quality education. And on the opposite end, you have, for example, I forgot who touched on this earlier, but the opposite of redlining, reverse redlining, where there's a concentration of poverty and low income populations where you don't get those services, that same quality of services and businesses, and then your education fails or does not stand up to par to other better quality schools. So it's still pretty prevalent, even if it's not overt, by cities and counties designating what kind of housing can be built and developed.
And I was just going to mention, it sounded like you were describing Clovis, which I have no issues with Clovis. My son Stia lives in Clovis. I have people that I love that live in Clovis, but they are a very exclusive community, so to speak, and they just recently were sued and lost a lawsuit where because they failed to zone for sufficient multifamily housing, which tends to be less expensive and thus more accessible to racial minorities who tend to be lower income. And so that's one way that some jurisdictions, I don't know whether there was discriminatory intent there or not, but the effect was the same, right? It keeps out lower income individuals who tend to be people of color, and that's how you get some jurisdictions with great schools, a lot of like great amenities that are out of the reach of a lot of low income people of color that perhaps even work in the communities and just don't have access to what they have to offer.
And just wanted to I had a person who wanted specifically me to ask you about the Clovis, about what's going on in Clovis, but I think Marcos, you really addressed that really well. So I think we can go to our last question, and this is, I think, a very good one from I got this texted to me. But if we can do and we'll each member of the panel can answer this question. What's the one thing we can do as a society to ensure fair and equal housing for as many people as possible? And we'll just start with Blanca and go on from there. So Blanca, what's the one thing? What's the most important thing society can do to make sure that people have fair and equitable housing?
I think we need to see a commitment from our local governments and state governments to prioritize affordable housing and to prioritize investment in existing communities, because we see a lot of communities in Tulare County where, like I said earlier, there's a lot of infrastructure and service gaps, and that includes housing, substandard housing. So if we need to see that commitment by pausing sprawling developments that are not only going for market rate or higher, but are not catering to these existing communities that have been faced with systemic oppression and systemic racism.
Thank you. Patty, why don't we go next with you?
Okay, I would say education is absolutely key. And I say that in terms of educating our society, from childhood on up, how important that is to provide quality education to everybody, the opportunity for education. And then also in terms of on a regular basis, educating our communities, as I mentioned earlier, so that they can understand their rights, and people who have not had access to all of the things available to make change in government, in their communities, in the planning, in just their schools, everything that involves living in a safe and healthy community. I think educating around the issues and providing more access to people to be involved, I think would make a huge difference.
Tom, you're next up on my computer layout, so you're good to go.
Yeah, so we need to pass inclusionary housing ordinances in the Central Valley. We have precious few of them, and they basically require that of every new project that gets built, or so many permits, there has to be so many from the different income levels in the community. And that's the true way to combat what has been exclusionary zoning and some of the patterns that we've seen in the past. Inclusionary housing ordinances.
Jim, can we elaborate on what that can you share what that actually means, inclusionary housing, for like, if I've never heard that before, what that looks like in real life?
Yeah, there's about 100 cities in California right now that have ordinances that usually are a variation on the same theme. But essentially, if a developer comes in and says, I want to develop 200 units of housing, they might say that 10% of them or 15% of those have to be low income housing. And then they either work with a nonprofit or other developer to do that piece of it, or they do it themselves. And they and some of those ordinances allow for an in lieu payment. If you don't build the housing, then you have to pay a fee so that housing can be built elsewhere, the affordable housing.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Marcos, you're next up on my computer screen. So what can society do to ensure fair housing for all?
I'm going to take a more philosophical approach. I think have some empathy, like just understand what it's like to be poor, struggle, and try to save your pennies to try to buy a house or just not live paycheck to paycheck. I think if people just put themselves in the shoes, or someone who's trying to reintegrate into society that was formerly incarcerated, whatever the case might be, if you put yourself in that person's shoes, if society can do that as a whole, whatever policy prescription you want, it's easy, right? But people need to first um, uh, accept or be open to the idea that these policies are actually necessary. Because once that happens, everything else falls in line.
And Miguel, you'll have the last word on this topic.
So, as a governmental agency representative, I would advocate for our community members to hold your elected officials accountable, both at the local level, at the state level, at the national level. Because what happens is that the policy that gets formulated, that's what we get, what we have to implement. That's what we have to work with. And so I think it's important, especially in Tulare County, to make sure that we start holding our elected officials accountable to ensure that the needs of all community members are being representative and taken into consideration.
Lisa, we'll let you take us home and have any final thoughts you might have.
No, I'm just eternally grateful. I appreciate all the brilliance that was here. I think that I feel better equipped as a community member. So for those of you that felt better equipped, please let us know. This was the last installment of the TC Voices conversation. So if you found value in what we shared with you, please send those encouragements. I'm sure the Facebook comments can share maybe where we need to grow or maybe what we learned. And so we'll do our best to go back and fill in those resources. But thank you to the brilliance and all the work that y'all do. Housing is a difficult arena to work in right now. So thank you. So please thank your everyday workers, your essential workers here on the panel and who you see day to day. And I really appreciate Marcos's lens. So just remember to be more compassionate and be a better human, and that'll create a very easy way for us to help.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And
Thank you.
Just wanted to mention in the TC Voices in a form will be coming back in the fall, and hopefully we will be doing hybrid broadcasts and also in-person forums in downtown Visalia at 210. So while TC Voices will be quiet during the summer, we will be back in a forum in the fall when everyone is hopefully vaccinated and we see this pandemic in the rearview mirror, or way in the rearview mirror, and we can meet in person. But again, I want to thank all the panelists for showing up, and I want to thank all the panelists who showed up for all of the TC Voices webinars we've had over these last 6 months. I thank you for all the viewers, and good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.